Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Sean Meyer. I'm a co-founder and a consultant to the back from the Brink Coalition. I'm joined today by my colleagues Madison Arnold Skirbo, Denise Duffield, Alex Jassett, and Peter Wilk. I see many familiar faces and so many new ones. It looks like we have over 100 folks here with us this evening, and that's really quite terrific. We come into this evening's conversation concerned, but also determined. The war in Ukraine has really put into sharp focus the dangers posed by nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war. We're hearing pretty bad things about the Biden administration's nuclear posture review, notably their intention to reaffirm that the US reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first. But we're fired up too, because this is really a tremendous opportunity to build support and to make progress toward a world free of nuclear weapons. The public's paying attention and they're concerned. And this war really has laid bare the truth that nuclear weapons don't make us safe, and it's well past time to get serious about abolishing them. But that won't happen unless we the people really demand it. And that's why we're here, that's why you're here. And hopefully you'll all come away from this evening excited as well and with tangible ideas for how to make a difference and get involved. So thank you again for being here. So tonight we have a two-part program. We'll begin with a presentation about the nuclear weapons dimensions of the war in Ukraine by Zia Mian, followed by a Q&A. We'll then hear brief presentations from Denise and Madison about back from the Brink strategies and priorities and actions you can take in your community right now, followed by another Q&A. But before we begin, we want to cover a few housekeeping items. So out of respect for the speakers, we're going to keep the chat closed during presentations and then open it up for Q&A. And we really ask folks to keep the chat focused on your questions so it's easier for all of us to follow along. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Zia Mian. Zia is a physicist and a co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security. His research interests include issues of nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, disarmament, and international peace and security. He's the co-editor of Science and Global Security and also co-chair of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. He's the co-author of Unmaking the Bomb and editor of several books, and he's made 2 documentary films on peace and security in South Asia. In 2018, he was selected as one of the 60 faces of CND by the UK Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament to mark its 60th anniversary. In 2021, he was elected a fellow of the American Physical Society, and earlier this year was appointed by the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. He has served on the boards of the Arms Control Association, Peace Action, Abolition 2000, and the United Nations NGO Committee on Disarmament, Peace and Security. And put more simply, Zia is one of the most effective nuclear abolition advocates on the planet today. So welcome, Zia.
Thank you, Sean. It's a very kind and slightly overwhelming introduction, because now people expect a lot, and it's always more than one can ever deliver. Thank you, everyone, for being part of the conversation today, because I think it does matter that at times of crisis, people of good conscience gather to organize and reflect and to learn from each other and to think about how to intervene individually and collectively to try and prevent tragedy and pave the path to a better tomorrow. So let me try and make a couple of observations to help set the frame for the discussion and the need for intervention by people across society. So the first observation I want to make, and many of you may have a similar feeling, is that for peace activists, and especially people from the anti-nuclear weapons movement, nothing that has happened in the last month or so is a surprise. Because when you think back on the history of the nuclear age and interpret today in the context of how we got here, This is something that is built into the system of nuclear weapons, nation states, great powers, and national interests. This is the machine that is just doing what it's supposed to do, of generating crisis and the risk of nuclear war. So let me unpack that briefly for 1 second. So everybody kind of woke up to this crisis when, in particular, when President Putin of Russia, made this graphic statement to the world that you should stay out of Russia's way, otherwise you will face consequences like you have never seen in your history. And we all understood that because Russia has nuclear weapons, this was a threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And some of us will think, oh yeah, well, President Trump, was talking about fire and fury like you've never seen. So it's not just a Russian thing. But actually, this is the founding script of the nuclear weapons age. These were actually some of the first words that were ever said about nuclear weapons that most Americans and the world actually heard. And it was President Truman. From the White House, after the bombing of Hiroshima, they released a famous statement in which President Truman told the world for the first time about nuclear weapons, in which he said, we have a bomb. It destroyed what he said was a military base, without mentioning that the entire city where that base was had been destroyed. But he said, and this is the key point, that if the Japanese don't do what we want, there will be a reign of ruin like there has never been in the history of the world. So this idea that you are breaking new historical ground with the threat of use of nuclear weapons is exactly how nuclear weapons were introduced to the world. And that's the point of the nuclear threat. That's the point of the nuclear weapon. It is the shock and awe promise that launched the nuclear weapons age. And so all Putin has done is to just pick up the script that people with nuclear weapons have always had at hand to talk about their weapons and the power they think it gives them, which is to make history through violence and destruction. But the author of that text was President Truman. And President Truman actually knew all about this even before the bomb had ever been built and used. Because in April 1945, he had just become president, and he was told by the Secretary of War, what we now call the Secretary of Defense, Henry Stimson, that the atomic bomb is almost finished. And Truman didn't know about this, even though he was vice president for Roosevelt. He said, Stimson told Truman, the bomb is almost finished. It will be the most terrible weapon that has ever existed. All of civilization may be at risk. And Truman said, go ahead. So that's where this all comes from. Because once it was set in motion, there was no way it was ever going to stay in one set of hands. And so, A, there's no surprise. Secondly, the fact that Putin used nuclear weapons as a shield to invade Ukraine and to launch this terrible, appalling war with all this death and destruction and suffering, that's what nuclear armed states have done before. Because even though they talk about nuclear weapons as deterrence, which means that you're supposed to think of them as a defense, you're deterring somebody from doing something bad to you. In other words, you are guiltless. You have no goal of your own. You're just sitting there passively. And just in case somebody threatens you, the nuclear weapon is a deterrent. Please don't hurt me. Otherwise, I'll hurt you back. But that's not what nuclear weapons do most of the time. Most of the time, they are a shield for nuclear weapon states to try and do whatever they want, especially against countries that don't have nuclear weapons, and to hold everybody else at a distance. Don't get involved in my business. And we all know that the United States has done this and others have done this. And so the combination of having nuclear weapons, threatening nuclear weapons, and using them as a shield to pursue wars of aggression, no surprise. the last thing is that at least some of us have a historical memory that isn't just from books, but actually lived experience. Think back on the last 25 years. Right? After the Cold War ended, you had India and Pakistan testing nuclear weapons in 1998, and they had a war in 1999, where Pakistan used its new nuclear weapons as a shield to invade and try and create a crisis over Kashmir. Then we had the issue of the Iraq war. And it was all about the mushroom cloud and how if the worst weapons in the worst hands, and we had to go to war to prevent this. Then we had the North Korean crisis and the Iranian crisis. And so it's in fact been one crisis after another where nuclear weapons have played some kind of role and justified some kinds of actions. And so you wrap those things together, and no one who understands what nuclear weapons do in the world would have been surprised by any of this that's happening. And one thing I do want to draw your attention to is that even though the United States, Britain, France, and other countries, especially in Europe, have condemned Putin quite rightly for the terrible things he has done, and said, oh, there are war crimes and crimes against humanity, and there should be trials at the International Criminal Court and so on, none of them actually condemned the threat of use of nuclear weapons. Because they know that if you go down that road, then you are also guilty as charged. The second point I want to make is that there's always been a contest over nuclear weapons. Just because great powers and political leaders and presidents have them doesn't mean that people have accepted this. We all on this call know this. Many people on the call have spent years, their lives, trying to work against nuclear weapons and to make the world a better place. And the point you have to remember here is that, the struggle against nuclear weapons is as old as nuclear weapons itself. From the very beginning, the United Nations Resolution 1, which many of you know, called for a plan for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Right? Albert Einstein created one of the first anti-nuclear organizations actually in Princeton, just down the street from my office, the Emergency Committee of the Atomic Scientists. In 1946, he writes a letter to scientists all over the world asking for $1 million in 1946 to begin a campaign to educate and mobilize the public against nuclear weapons. Because in his letter, Einstein wrote that only an educated and insistent public, in other words, democratic action by educated and mobilized citizens, can hold back nuclear weapons. In other words, you can't trust governments. You can't trust political leaders. The people, once they know and are organized, are the only defense. And so that's been the constant struggle between people who have ambitions for themselves and their countries as leaders to make the world the way that they want, and good people of conscience everywhere, including in Russia. We've seen thousands of people being arrested in Russia, protesting this war, saying that, no, this is not what we want. You're not doing this in our name. And so this is the tension ultimately that is at play here between nuclear weapons and the interests of political leaders and nation states, and the possibility of informed, educated, democratic action. And just to kind of close the loop on Ukraine, I mean, we all worry about escalation, that this will run out of control, either deliberately or by accident, into the use of nuclear weapons, and that will run away. But you have to remember that everybody on both sides of this know this. The US and NATO know about escalation, and the Russians know about escalation. And we know this because the head of US Strategic Command, before the current one, General John Hyten, actually went on record and described the annual US nuclear war exercise. It's called Global Thunder, if you've never heard of it. And General Hyten said, we just had Global Thunder, the exercise, and it ended bad. And then he said, and you should read the speech, he said, it ends bad every time. It ends in all-out nuclear war every time. So they know that when nuclear war starts, even though Strategic Command may not want an all-out nuclear war, they can't stop it from turning into one. That's the logic of the war planning and the weapons and the decision making. The Russian side has the same logic. That their military exercise, nuclear war exercise, how many people have actually heard of the annual Russian nuclear war exercise? It's called Grom, which is Russian for thunder, which I find hilarious that they basically came up with the same name for their nuclear war exercises. But they have their nuclear war exercises, and they include escalation to all-out nuclear war. And Putin actually has said on television in Russia that, yeah, we will use our nuclear weapons if somebody attacks Russia with nuclear weapons, even if it's in retaliation to the Russians using nuclear weapons first. And the interviewer asked Putin, but if you have lots of nuclear weapons used, won't that end the world? And Putin said, why should I care about the world if there is no Russia? In other words, I will end the world. And that's our dilemma. This logic of escalation is familiar and practiced and understood by these two nuclear war machines, the Russian nuclear war machine and the US NATO nuclear war machine, because they actually exist connected to each other. They're not separate war machines at all. They're actually linked together because each one acts on the basis of what the other one will do, or that they're afraid that the other one might do or could do. And so it's actually one giant machine. It just has two drivers, but they're connected together. And that's our struggle. That we're in the US, and so we have to try and do something about decoupling the American nuclear war machine and trying to stop it from driving the rest of this machine into catastrophe. And here I think we have to begin, and I'll stop here, with the two fundamental tasks. One is that we have to focus on making people understand the underlying logic of this. It's not about some object, a nuclear warhead sitting on top of a missile or a nuclear bomb on an airplane. It's about these war machines with political leaders and war plans and threats and ideas about how to dominate and shape the world. And the people who benefit from this. You have to remember, people get paid a salary to make nuclear war plans, to fly nuclear bombers, and to sit and turn the key that will launch the nuclear missiles, and to pilot the nuclear submarines, and to design the nuclear weapons, and to explain why all this is so necessary. This is what puts their kids through college and will give them their pensions when they retire. So it's not just an object that we're worried about. It's a social institution, a political institution, an economic institution. And so we have to get people to understand that you can fight this in all of these ways. It's not an abstraction about deterrence. And the last thing that we have to do is to literally focus on this first principle, that the threat of use of nuclear weapons is a threat to commit an unbelievable crime against humanity. So don't talk to me about deterrence, because actually that's what you're doing, that you're threatening an unbelievable crime against humanity. And to just give you the context of this, I'll stop here. In 1961, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution that said the threat and use of nuclear weapons is a violation of the Charter of the United Nations and a crime against humanity. And it's as if it never happened. But the US happily says, oh, the United Nations voted on Russia. What about all the other United Nations votes? The ones that the United States doesn't want to talk about. So we have to get people to understand that this is ultimately their dilemma, that what they're being told and what actually is happening when it comes to nuclear weapons are two completely different things, but we actually can have ways of taking this on, because we've always been taking this on. And one reason we haven't had a nuclear war so far is not because of enlightened political leadership, it's because we've been very lucky and because peace activists have not stopped. And with that, I'll stop.
I'm sort of blown away by those remarks, Zia. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the chat. We're going to spend some time, and Alex, if you can go ahead and do that, and maybe I'll sort of get started by asking you questions, Zia, and then we'll look at the chat and we'll have a conversation for a bit. I've actually been using the term the threat to commit mass murder, which is a term that feels that might resonate with more people as opposed to crimes against humanity. So that's a term phrase I've been using a lot lately in the very same context that you used it, Zia. I wonder, sort of in this same sort of vein. So I mentioned at the top that we've heard that the administration is really going to walk back their ideas around use policy, and that the president had said during the campaign, and has said as far back as 2017, that he believes in a no first use policy. And lo and behold, it sounds like this nuclear posture review is going to not do that. And I guess I would just ask you to reflect on, isn't this just the absolute wrong signal to send to the world at this moment, while we're dealing with a nuclear armed autocrat? Isn't that the exact wrong signal to be sending, that we in fact reserve the right to commit mass murder or commit massive crimes against humanity?
So thanks for that question, Sean. One thing that's worth thinking about is that there are many differences between democratic societies and non-democratic societies. Where there isn't a difference is when it comes to nuclear weapons in these two kinds of societies. It makes no difference whether you're a democracy or an autocracy when it comes to your nuclear weapons policy making. So in no democratic country was there ever actually a democratic debate about should we have nuclear weapons. They just did it in secret. And as I mentioned, Vice President Truman wasn't told and Congress weren't told about the Manhattan Project during World War II. Right? And the same is true in all the other democratic countries. And when you think about where's the democratic process in making decisions about nuclear weapons, the answer is there isn't one. So on this issue, there is actually no significant difference between democratic and non-democratic societies when it comes to nuclear weapons. And so it's no surprise that they end up taking the same kinds of positions. Have you ever asked yourself the question, why does the United States and Russia basically have the same nuclear arsenal, even though everything else is so different in so many ways? Really, this is the one thing you could agree on, that you need land-based missiles, bombers, submarines, and command and control systems that look almost exactly alike. And the answer is that the two nuclear weapon systems define each other, regardless of the rest of society. And so in terms of the nuclear posture review, I'm actually not surprised at all that the Biden administration has continued business as usual. Not at all. If you actually look back, many presidents, when they've come into office or in getting towards office, have talked about how nuclear weapons are dangerous and something needs to be done. Even Republican presidents have said, keeping our nuclear weapons on alert is a really bad idea. We shouldn't do this. Yeah. George Bush even said this. They come into office and all of this disappears. Without exception, Republican and Democrat, it all disappears. Obama made his famous speech about, in Prague, we have to get rid of nuclear weapons and we have a moral responsibility to do so. And the nuclear posture review that came out and the decisions that were made, we got a vast, multi-generational, multi-trillion-dollar nuclear modernization program out of it. and a nuclear posture review that didn't actually change very much at all. So again, why be surprised that the nuclear machine inside the government overwhelms any possibility of policy reform? Ultimately, if you go back all the way to the first nuclear posture review, which took place under President Clinton, all the way up to now, it's been turning glad to happy in the fundamentals of changing nuclear policy, regardless of all of the passage of time and all of the different other politics of each of these administrations. So it's no surprise. And in this case, we already knew that there was going to not be much chance of it. But in this case, the pressure from European countries whose leaders have been told that only US nuclear weapons and the threat of their use keeps you safe. Well, of course, they're going to panic and say, well, make sure that doesn't go away. So, but even before that, they were saying the same thing to President Obama in his posture review. Please don't take away this. So you can't expect too much change of this. It is bad, but one shouldn't be surprised that it's turned out to be this way, because ultimately, this is really something that, unless the president is willing to stake an administration on changing nuclear policy, you're not going to get much change, because the nuclear machine has too many supporters in Congress, too many generals who will then speak up and say, look what you've done. And that's not a risk that they're willing to take in the absence of enormous public pressure demanding an alternative.
Well, there's a lot to consider here. We have a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm going to do my best. One of the ones that certainly I expected, which is, wouldn't have Ukraine been better if it hadn't given up its nuclear weapons? Could you speak to that for a moment, Zia?
Sure. It's a question that's been asked a lot. And the issue is that the question assumes an impossible situation. That at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that would it have been possible for Ukraine to make that decision and everything else remained the same? And the answer is no. This is not one of those things where you can say, well, let's just assume this one thing changes and everything else stays the same. That wasn't going to happen because the United States wasn't going to let it happen. Russia wasn't going to let it happen. And there was no way that Ukrainians even wanted it to happen. So the idea that somehow one part of that changed. If the United States and Russia were willing to let Ukraine have nuclear weapons, it would have fundamentally changed the politics of Ukraine and everybody else. So you can't just isolate this one variable and try and assume, well, suppose. It's not a credible possibility. And I think that what we have to actually ask the question is not so much about Ukraine keeping nuclear weapons, but the fact that that Putin now says, oh, the Ukrainians are secretly trying to make nuclear weapons, or might be. And countries that don't have nuclear weapons, some of them will now think exactly along the lines of this question: should we try and get nuclear weapons for ourselves now to make sure this doesn't happen to us? And that's what you will actually see as a predictable dynamic, that not just the former Prime Minister of Japan saying, well, perhaps we should ask for US nuclear protection, or, and there are people saying perhaps Japan should have nuclear weapons, perhaps South Korea should have nuclear weapons. And during the Trump administration, people were saying this might actually be a good idea, because then they would help fight China for us. So the logic proliferation is something that one can expect coming out of this, but this kind of counterfactual possibility that Ukraine might have kept nuclear weapons and all the other politics of the last 30 years would not have been changed as a consequence. It's quite plausible Ukraine wouldn't actually have been allowed to function as a state by anybody if it had even tried to suggest that it might keep nuclear weapons. So it's not a plausible possibility that that changes and nothing else changes in all of the things that have happened in the past 30 years.
Thanks, Zia. We're gonna keep going for at least a little while longer. There's just a lot of questions in the chat, and of course we're not going to be able to get to all of them. And I think what we're going to try to do after the event is we'll gather up what's in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer questions and get back to folks. If there's specific questions directed to Zia, we'll do our best to, I can talk with you, Zia, and see if we can get a response back to folks. But I do apologize that we just have a tremendous number of questions. One of the questions that was posed was related to the TPNW, the ban treaty, and whether perhaps our best hope is to really focus on the humanitarian aspects of nuclear weapons. And could you speak to that?
Yeah, so I think the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the ban treaty, many of us rightly see it as emerging out of a humanitarian sensibility about what nuclear weapons do. And it builds on a long experience of the humanitarian approach to thinking about weapons and war, whether it was landmines or cluster munitions and now nuclear weapons. And there's also a campaign now to ban the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And we're just seeing how terrible that is, again, in the cities of Ukraine. But we've seen it before, whether it was the Israelis bombing Gaza or the Saudis in Yemen, or all the other wars where explosive weapons have been used in populated areas. And so one thing to think about is that the humanitarian thing only has traction where you see use. It speaks to our imagination of what nuclear use would look like and the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The other big advantage of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that we can think about how to do work with now is that it forbids the threat of use of nuclear weapons. Not just the use of nuclear weapons, but the threat of use of nuclear weapons is made illegal under this treaty. And so the question is, what do we do with that? That now we have a legal instrument that says you will not threaten even to commit this horrible crime against human beings and nature. And there is something that the TPNW, the treaty, broke completely new ground. And that is where I think we can actually have a really interesting debate about how to educate people in the United States that you think you're being defended by something they tell you is a nuclear deterrent. But look, most of the world thinks that the threat of use of nuclear weapons is actually illegal. So let's have a conversation about the threat of use and what that means for deterrence. Sure, the humanitarian part is important, but that's about the use. What about the threat of use? Let's just talk about that, something that happens all day, every day. Strategic Command is very proud of the fact, as they say on record, that US nuclear weapons are working every day to deter everybody. The head of Strategic Command said, my job is to deter all countries all the time, which is slightly scary. You think you're that paranoid? But that's how they think about it, that these weapons are constantly putting out this force field of deterrence. And so that's what we can talk to people about, the TPNW versus this idea of threatening crimes against humanity as your normal day-to-day national security strategy. Let's have a conversation about that. That's where the TPNW may actually be able to help us along with the humanitarian part right now.
Okay, thank you, Zia. This has been a tremendous conversation and hearing from you. Really a lot to take in. We're going to transition now and spend the remainder of our time, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleagues Denise and Madison, and we're going to talk about Back from the Brink. And I think there's a lot of questions in the chat about, okay, Zia's just presented the machine that we have to confront, and we want to talk to you about what we're doing as Back from the Brink to do just that, and the work we're doing, and really importantly, how folks can continue to be involved, because of course a number of the folks on this call today have been in the fight for a very long time and will continue to be. And so, and again, I do want to just stress that there is a lot of questions in the chat. It's been sort of difficult to sort of just keep track while paying attention to Zia, but we'll take a look at that after the fact, and we'll do our best to respond individually, and we are going to be sending follow-up emails to everyone who came, and we may address some things in that as well. So with that, I'm going to.
Thank you everyone for being so patient with me, but let me commend to you this book. Right? Because if you want a place to start to think about why nuclear weapons are useless to Putin and are proved useless to the United States and NATO, why the Ukrainians are resisting in the same way that the Afghans and the Iraqis and the Vietnamese and everybody were able to fight off a superpower, and that actually it is about the will of people, that this is where one might start, the late, great Jonathan Schell. So I commend this to you very highly, especially at this time of crisis.
I started in this work having read The Fate of the Earth by Jonathan Schell. So thank you so much, Zia. I know you're going to stick around for the remainder of our time. And I'm going to turn it over to Denise Duffield. And she's going to talk a little bit about Back from the Brink. And Denise, it's all yours.
Right. I'm going to start on the will of people will be the segue here from Zia's talk into Back from the Brink. Hi, everyone. My name is Denise Duffield. I'm the Associate Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles, and I serve on the steering committee of the Back from the Brink Coalition. As many of you know, Back from the Brink is a US-based grassroots coalition of individuals, organizations, and elected officials working together on a multi-year campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and to secure a set of common sense US nuclear weapons policies that will make the world safer, healthier, and more just. The campaign was founded in the fall of 2017 by leaders from the Union of Concerned Scientists and Physicians for Social Responsibility as a vehicle to build broad public and congressional support for these policies, and to do it in a way that builds real political power by bringing people and communities together in common cause. Back from the Brink was also established as a collaborative effort designed to not be owned by any single individual or organization, and to provide a simple, scalable way that anyone, any activist, any organization, any elected official can engage their local community in a national campaign to help build political will for fundamental changes in US nuclear weapons policy. We know that members of Congress aren't going to make these policies a priority if their constituents don't demand it. Yet even now, many people don't know just how dangerous, how expensive, how unjust, or how harmful to health and the environment these weapons are. To change that, we have to talk about nuclear weapons to more people, to different people, to local communities, to local, state, and federal leaders, and Back from the Brink is an effective means to do just that. Next slide. Back from the Brink's fundamental mission is to help achieve the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons. We call for the United States to lead multilateral negotiations among all nuclear weapon states to pave the way for the United States to align and comply with the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The treaty, which entered into force in January 2021, is a legal global prohibition on the development, possession, and use of nuclear weapons. Back from the Brink works to advance a comprehensive policy agenda, 5 common sense policy solutions that, if enacted, would reflect fundamental changes and reform US nuclear weapons policy. We call on the United States to actively pursue a verifiable agreement among nuclear armed states to eliminate their arsenals, to renounce the option of using nuclear weapons first, to end the sole unchecked authority of any president to launch a nuclear attack, to take US nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert, and to cancel the plan to replace the entire US arsenal with enhanced weapons. Next slide. Over 400 health, policy, faith, environmental, climate, and justice groups have endorsed Back from the Brink today, ranging from large national organizations to local grassroots groups that are at the core of Back from the Brink organizing. Next slide. To date, 58 municipalities and 6 state legislative bodies have voted to adopt resolutions supporting Back from the Brink's policy platform, from small towns to major cities such as Baltimore, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Tucson, Washington, D.C., Boston, Minneapolis, as well as the state of California, the state of Oregon, the Maine Senate, and the New Jersey Assembly. If you visit the municipalities and states page on our website, each one of these seals links to the resolution that was adopted. All of the resolutions include support for Back from the Brink's 5 policy solutions, and activists often customize the resolutions to make them more relevant and persuasive to their communities. Some also, for example, include support for divestment or making the city a nuclear weapons free zone. And these resolution efforts are most often led by local community members or organizations, many of whom are here with us tonight, including local chapters of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Veterans for Peace, Pax Christi, Americans Friends Service Committee. Individuals too have organized in their communities around resolution efforts. Sandra Yarney from C Code PACE Response has led 5 successful efforts in New Hampshire. Each resolution paves the way for the next, as municipalities can see that they are joining other towns and cities throughout the country and are part of a larger movement to abolish nuclear weapons and reform US nuclear weapons policy. Next slide. Most Back from the Brink resolutions include a call for the US to embrace the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which means these municipalities and states can join hundreds of cities worldwide that are part of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons Cities Appeal. And we're proud that to date, the majority of US cities that have joined ICANN Cities Appeal came through Back from the Brink resolutions. Next slide. Back from the Brink has also been endorsed by over 320 local and state elected officials across 41 states who signed an open letter to President Biden and members of Congress last September calling for bold action on nuclear weapons policy. These local and state leaders understand that nuclear weapons are a local issue in the same way that a global pandemic or the climate crisis are local issues, except there's no vaccine or adaptation strategies or mitigation strategies that will protect us from nuclear war. The only way to truly do that is to eliminate nuclear weapons. So Back from the Brink is proud of all we've accomplished over the last few years, but we also know that changing the nuclear status quo will require much more, and that right now this is an all hands on deck moment. As part of our efforts to build upon our accomplishments and scale up our organizing, we've developed new ways for both organizations and individuals to engage with our coalition and our campaign. And to talk more about ways to get involved with Back from the Brink, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Madison Arnold Scarbo.
Thanks, Denise. Hello, everyone. My name is Madison Arnold Scarbo. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an outreach and communication specialist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I have the pleasure now of sharing some really specific opportunities on how to get involved with Back from the Brink and hopefully answer some of the questions in the chat that I saw that are basically, what do we do? So what I really love about Back from the Brink is that our power really comes from the variety of folks from all walks of life who use their individual skills and networks to get involved in the way that works best for them. So I'm going to highlight a whole bunch of things that we can all do to get us closer to a world free of nuclear weapons. And we'll be sharing a link in the chat later on, as well as in our follow-up email to a webpage where all of the information that I mentioned will be, with a bunch of links to get you started. And we'll hopefully have some time at the end to answer some more questions. Next slide, let's dive in. So how to organize locally. Organizing locally is really the key to our Back from the Brink campaign. And the bread and butter of that approach is passing Back from the Brink resolutions in local, county, and state legislatures. These resolutions are an opportunity to educate the public, as well as our decision makers, about the problems and solutions of nuclear weapons. And gathering a group together is a really concrete, meaningful way to organize locally. And while each community is different, as Denise mentioned, we've passed a bunch of resolutions so far. So we have a lot of resources, both people, physical and digital, that we can share to help you with your efforts. One of the main activities involved in passing a resolution is contacting your officials at every level of government, because our decision makers really need to hear from us, their constituents. So whether you prefer sending them an email, talking to them on the phone, reaching out to them on social media, or actually talking to them in person, building connections to your officials is one of the best ways to leverage your power as a constituent and build champions who we can call on to pass Back from the Brink resolutions and enact the policy points in our policy platform. And we aren't just advocating for policy reform, we are really bringing communities together, like our tagline says. And we're building power towards a world free from the threats of nuclear weapons. So a big part of that is building relationships with individuals and organizations, especially those folks who might be new to the issue or whose voices may have been excluded from the conversation. We really believe it's important to stand in solidarity with other justice movements, and we recognize the interconnectedness of the many injustices we face. So how do we actually do this organizing? Next slide. So within Back from the Brink, we have two systems that we have to support our local organizing efforts. So the first one is our local organizing meetups. These are monthly gatherings for organizers to get together from other activists around the country, share updates, get advice, ask questions, and learn from each other. And this is really geared towards folks who are either currently or interested in getting involved locally. And we meet on the third Tuesdays of the month at 1 p.m. So our next meeting is April 19th. We can definitely get you the Zoom information if you're interested. Secondly, we also have a hub model, which is our term for our distributed organizing model. A Back from the Brink hub is any group of 3 or more people or an existing local organization within a community or region who come together to engage in activities and advocacies within their communities in support of Back from the Brink. Hubs will be listed on the Back from the Brink websites as point of contacts, and they receive support, training, and guidance from our national team. And again, there's a short form to fill out to express your interest. So if you're interested in either starting or joining a hub, we would love to hear from you. Next slide. And I want to call your attention to a page on our website, preventnuclearwar.org, where we have a lot of advocacy tools, including sample endorsement requests, sample resolutions, and a bunch of other stuff that can be helpful in your local organizing efforts. And when in doubt, can't stress this enough, please email us. info@preventnuclearwar.org is a great way to get in contact with us. You know, we're real people who really check that email. I would love to hear from you and see what we can do to give you personalized advice or resources or thoughts about your specific context. Next slide. And if you haven't already, please follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handles are on the slide. And if you're especially interested in social media, I would invite you to join our monthly social media collaboratory gatherings. This is an innovative space where we're really focused on making social media social. We co-create, strategize, and collaborate, building out the social media presence of nuclear weapons abolition accounts, and improving our own social media skills. So it's open to anyone, no matter what your skill level or your comfort level with social media. And if I can say so myself as one of the organizers, they're pretty fun. We play music, we learn together, and it's just a really cool space to talk about social media and nuclear weapons. And those are on the 4th Tuesdays at 1 p.m. And again, all of this information will be in the link we share shortly. Next slide. And of course, we don't want to forget about traditional media. So we have a slide in here to remind folks that submitting letters to the editor is a really awesome opportunity, an effective way to share your message on nuclear weapons abolition with a large audience, both the public as well as decision makers who keep their eye on LTEs. And we have a bunch of sample talking points as well as advice that we can share. Next slide. And if you're here representing, or you're even just a part of an organization, maybe it's a nonprofit, a faith-based institution, or even a for-profit business, and the first step, one thing you can do is endorse Back from the Brink. And if you're maybe one of the 400 plus organizations who have already endorsed, the next step would be to become a coalition partner. And these coalition partners take a more active role in supporting a coalition and are a crucial part of our organizing model. And it almost goes without saying, but I will say it, that another great way to support our coalition or campaign is to donate. Again, you can find all of the information on our website, preventnuclearwar.org. We appreciate any and all donations you can contribute to help as we continue building this power and organizing locally towards a world free from nuclear weapons. So before we transition to the final section here today, I want to switch gears for a moment and take a moment to acknowledge a fact that nuclear weapons are a manifestation of a deeply unjust system. Zia touched on this earlier. We believe that at Back from the Brink, that achieving true human security demands a commitment to confronting and dismantling the long-standing racial, social, environmental, and economic injustices that threaten the lives and well-being of so many people. Nuclear weapons policy is undemocratic, like we've talked about, and it's an extreme example of power consolidated into the hands of a small number of people. Back from the Brink believes that working to eliminate nuclear weapons must therefore be a part of a large, diverse, intersectional global movement for peace and justice and democracy. And that is why we have become a mobilizing partner for the Poor People's Campaign Moral March on Washington on June 18th. We want to add our voices to this powerful call for a transformation in the country and fundamental shifts in how and where our tax dollars are spent, away from nuclear weapons and towards community needs. And we want the nuclear disarmament, peace, environmental justice, climate, faith communities, etc., to join us. So you can learn more and RSVP at the Poor People's Campaign website, poorpeoplescampaign.org, and we will be sending out more information. So if you're not on our Back from the Brink email list, please sign up again at our website, preventnuclearwar.org. All right, well, thank you so much. And that is the end of my remarks, and I will turn it over to Dr. Peter Wilk, who is the administrative chair of Back from the Brink.
Thanks so much, Madison and Denise, for those excellent presentations covering the basics of Back from the Brink and all the opportunities to engage locally with current efforts to advocate for fundamental changes to U.S. nuclear policy. We are running a bit long, and we still do want to take some time for questions. So we are going to run to at least 10 minutes after the top of the hour with these questions. We're going to open up the chat to take questions. At this point, I'll read out as many as I can in the time available, direct them to particular speakers if appropriate. I'm sure we won't have time for all the questions, so we will be recording the chat and trying to get back to folks after the webinar with responses. While you're formulating your questions and putting them in the chat, I just want to observe that it's amazing to see so many of you joining us today. It was a great opening talk from Zia, and a lot of people paying a lot of attention. It speaks to the urgency we're all feeling, in fact, especially with the tragic war underway in Ukraine and increased public awareness of nuclear risks. So to just get us started, I have a question for Denise or Madison. Might you share an example of a successful local action that's already taken place?
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. I can just quickly tell folks about a specific example. I used to live in Oregon for a year, Portland, Oregon. I saw at least a few Oregon folks that looked familiar. I'm not sure if they're still on the call, but we passed a Back from the Brink resolution in the state of Oregon. And there was also one in Portland and recently Salem, and maybe a few others that I'm forgetting. But what was really powerful about that effort is it was a great example of a coalition of folks coming together from a whole bunch of different groups, including atomic veterans, Marshallese communities, peace groups, religious institutions, racial justice organizations, some folks working on the situation in Hanford. And it was a really cross-pollinating power building event. So it was lots of different folks involved, and it was really great. And I know I see some folks here, so it makes my heart happy. And that was sort of how I got involved in this movement. So shout out to Oregon.
Thanks, Maddie, for that example. I don't see as many questions as we had anticipated, frankly. So this can be more of a conversation. The idea of this originally, when we first imagined these open houses a few months ago, before the Ukraine war began, they were really imagined as an entry point for conversation with those of us more deeply engaged in Back from the Brink organizing, to connect with and hear from, engage with those of you who are out in the field doing Back from the Brink organizing one way or another, or interested in it. So we have a question from Jim. Can you give an example of a church that engaged in this work? And it could be, yeah, Denise or Madison could think about it. You're muted. Let's see.
We have some resolutions that have been entirely organized by not one specific church, but for example, Pax Christi chapters. On our website, on the, I'm going to put the chat in there, I'm going to put it in the link. You'll see that I think we have as many, we probably have as many endorsers from the faith community as we do from the peace community. And United Church of Christ, Methodist, Presbyterian, we have just all kinds of interdenominational support. In terms of like a specific, one specific, parish that organized a resolution, I'm not aware of that, but the faith community is one of the biggest strengths that we have. This is a moral issue. And that's another really good reason and happy reason that we're going to be joining up with the Poor People's Campaign. This is a moral issue, and the moral voice on this issue is extremely powerful. So I think I posted the right link in the chat. Did I? Yes, I did. So if you click that link, you'll go down and you'll see all of the faith groups, national ones. You can sort it just by state and see where they're from. And also reach out to us and we can hook you up with one in your local community.
Okay, thanks, Denise. A question from Catherine, which is somewhat similar, but might lead to something different. What can people do on a community level? How can one, I'm taking this, do some of the hub kind of organizing that we're hoping will happen?
Well, a very quick answer, I did put in the chat the link that I mentioned. So, one way is to become a hub. How does one actually do that, right? I think it's really about building relationships. So, building relationships with new organizations and, just starting the conversation, inviting people to meetings like this, or, sending folks the recording, really just starting that conversation, and then utilizing the resources. And if you are looking for a resource and you can't find it, again, emailing us or asking us, anyone who is speaking on this call, we would love to help answer, each person's specific community situation. We have lots of ideas, but of course, every community is different, and different strategies will work better in different areas.
Thanks, Madison. And I'm going to sort of interrupt a bit to Sean, direct your attention. I saw a chat comment from someone saying they'd sent you a question because the chat wasn't open to everybody. So if those questions might be worth paying attention to, please interrupt me. And also I want to respond to
and Peter, just to acknowledge that there's something going on with my chat, and Peter, Matt, I am seeing yours, but I'm not quite sure what the issue is here. But if we don't get to it, Peter, I'll certainly be in touch with you to answer those questions to the best of my ability.
Okay, great. And then I see a suggestion from someone named Peter Burgle about having breakout rooms in the future. And that really, again, in our original conception of open houses, that was to be included. And yet this time it seemed important to touch on sort of the big picture of nuclear weapons policy and the terrible place we find ourselves in. And for that reason, we invited Zia to give that great opening talk, which meant we had less time for this part of the discussion. So our next open house, we plan to do open houses quarterly, and the next one will include breakout rooms. So, and
Peter, just to stress that these local organizers meetups that Madison mentioned really are those opportunities for sort of getting the work done and sort of having folks who are out there doing this great work in their communities to get together and talk and to share information. So we really encourage folks who are on this call to the best of their ability to attend those meetups. And again, we'll regularly be sending out information about when those meetings are and how to register, etc.
Excellent. So I think maybe I'm going to take just one or two more questions. So put some up there if you want to be sure to be included. There's one from an old colleague, Art Milholland, talking about civilian-based nonviolent defense to create security without weapons. Should that be pursued to replace the illusionary security of nuclear weapons policy? And I think this in a way speaks also to some of the faith-based organizing, as well as Veterans for Peace, that I know has a position that really opposes all war. So I'm not sure if one of the panelists would like to comment on that.
If I might, Peter, I can talk about that a little bit, if that's all right with Madison and Denise. And I want to go back to the book that I held up earlier by Jonathan Schell. So it's called The Unconquerable World, and the subtitle is Power, Nonviolence, and the Will of the People. And one of the arguments that he makes there is that despite nuclear weapons, it's turned out to be effectively impossible, even for great powers with thousands of nuclear weapons, to actually conquer and occupy and rule other countries in any effective, enduring way. And for a whole variety of reasons. But central to that is that in modern society, people themselves need to support the structure of government up to a point for it to be able to function at all. And so the key thing that he suggests is that politics itself is a form of nonviolence, because the alternative is to basically be fighting over everything rather than discussing and organizing. And in this respect, modern society relies on consent and support. And by the withdrawal of consent and support through political action, then basically you can make a society unconquerable and ungovernable. And you don't actually have to have, lots of weapons to kill people with, or even to use to defend yourself with. Because ultimately the question comes down to the fact that even if Putin conquers Ukraine by sheer force of destruction, there's no way that he is actually going to be able to subdue 40 million people with his secret police and his thugs and his kidnappings and his prisons. It's just not a practical proposition, because the Ukrainian people will actually have their own ideas of how they want to live and how they want to be organized. And there are ways, as Gene Sharp told so many of us in all his wonderful books, to organize non-violently and politically to withdraw consent from the exercise of power by states. And so there's a long, rich tradition of this, and it's there to guide people who want to learn more about it. So I think starting with Jonathan Schell's book and then pursuing that literature may help answer your question.
Thank you, Zia. And that may be bringing us full circle. And we're going to move to stopping with the questions, but I note there are several interesting points people have made in the chat. I'm going to highlight one of those from Jackie Calbasso, noting that Back from the Brink and Mayors for Peace work in close alliance with one another. She put in the chat a link where you can get to the Mayors for Peace Action Toolkit. And if you don't have time to get to that, if you just Google Mayors for Peace, I'm sure that will help you get there as well. So I am going to shift to wrapping things up. It's really been a very wonderfully productive gathering. Thank you, Zia, for your thoughtful remarks that kicked off the conversation and finished us up with your comment as well. Thank you, Sean, Denise, and Madison, for all the opportunities for engagement that you've shared. Thanks, Alex, who you haven't seen on the screen, but he's provided all the behind-the-scenes technical support. So I did want to share a few thoughts of my own, really, very briefly. I know that these are very discouraging times. Waking up in the morning, digesting the news of the day, this is a very critical time. So many people are realizing, in fact, that the risks of nuclear weapons being actually used is upon us. We are entering, fortunately, at the same time, a new era of public debate over the direction of U.S. nuclear policy. So together, we have to intensify our efforts to elevate local voices in support of Back from the Brink's 5 nuclear policy solutions. Our connections are deepening with others advocating for justice on multiple interrelated issues. Our strength is growing. You have all shown that this evening. Please stay in touch. Contact us by email with your questions. Thank you for everything you've done and will be doing. Take care, everyone.